Hi, everyone. My name is Holly Stoneberg, and I'm the Education Program Coordinator for Portage Park District. And I'm sure, like me, a lot of you are nuts about squirrels, and that's why you're here tonight, to learn more about these furry little critters that we see every day. So, as always, I'll pause right here to talk about our mission. That QR code right there leads to our newsletter. It comes out the first Thursday of every month, and it has park information, a link to the education programs, highlights. Everything you need to know about the parks is in that newsletter, so make sure you subscribe to that. Our mission is to conserve Portage County's natural heritage and provide opportunities for its appreciation and enjoyment. And I feel like this is especially fitting today when we're talking about squirrels, because squirrels, in my opinion, are one of those underappreciated things. We see them all the time. We see them everywhere. It's one of those things that we might be taking for granted, but it's time we realize how important squirrels really are in our natural habitat. Okay. So there are four types of squirrels, specifically tree squirrels, that we're going to talk about today. And these are the ones that can be found in Ohio. So we have the eastern fox, the eastern gray, the red squirrel, and the southern flying squirrel. And lucky for us, our squirrels are doing great, right? All of them are listed as either common or game. And what game means is they actually have a bag limit. They can be hunted throughout a certain season. All of them, except for the southern flying squirrel, you can hunt if you are into that, right? When we talk about our squirrels, they're all in the order Rodentia, which means they are rodents, just like our groundhogs, and they're in the family Sciuridae, and that's just one of the things that connects all of them. Right now, I think we're going to pause for a second, and in the chat box, assuming I turned it on correctly, you guys want to throw in which one do you think is the most common? So in the chat box, take a second to tell me which one. Maybe I should move it so you can see the options. Fox, gray, red, or flying. Which squirrel do you see most often? Let's phrase it that way. Which squirrel do you see most often? Gray. Thank you, Erin. Which squirrel do you see most often? A black squirrel. Okay. Somebody's been around Kent. Yes. Anyone else want to ponder a guess? Erin sees the black most often. Black and gray. Definitely. Good. Yeah. If you want to keep guessing, go ahead and throw them in there. We're going to move along though. And we'll come back to that conversation a little bit later. I can get my mouse back to this screen. Okay. So where do squirrels live? So the squirrels that we're going to talk about today, like a variety of different places, right? They're pretty adaptable, so we can see them all over the place, but they like forests that are of different densities and have different tree types. But they also make different nests as well, if you want to talk about specifically where they live. So one that might not be as common are the dens that they make out of the cavities in trees, because right, we just see a hole in a tree and you never know what really is in there. It's a little less obvious, but they can use holes that are either natural, right, as the tree starts to break down, or it could have been made by another organism such as a woodpecker. They'll go in there and it's a little bit easier, right, because most of the work's already done for them. If they want to, they can put in leaves and moss and make it a little bit more comfy. They've even been known to gnaw around the outside to widen the opening a little bit. But for the most part, they don't have to do too much work with their nests that are within a tree cavity. But the ones that you might be seeing a lot more often right now is called a dray, and that's the picture on the left-hand side of your screen. So those are the leafy nests that we can see, especially now that most of our leaf coverage has fallen down. They're the chunks of leaf still stuck in the tree. And you'll tell that they're a squirrel nest and not a bird's nest because, one, they look like a big ball of leaves, and they're usually higher up in the tree and at weird angles, right? Usually a bird nest is in like the crook of a tree, right? So it looks a little bit more stable. squirrels' nests, even though they don't always look too stable to me. But you should be seeing them a lot more often now than we have when the leaves were still on the trees. But they're really good builders, right? They'll start by taking twigs and kind of weaving them together and making a little platform. And then they'll make that platform more sturdy by putting leaves and moss on top of it. And then they'll build that outer frame of it, the rest of the little dome, by weaving more twigs together and then shoving leaves and moss, sometimes even paper and cloth that they find, in order to make that outer dwelling, just to stabilize it a little bit more. And that's a great place, right, to keep them out of the weather. Some squirrels will change where they are depending on the season, right? A den within a tree cavity gives a little bit more protection from the weather, but some squirrels stay in drays all year long. They're just going to reinforce it as the seasons change. The other thing to note about squirrels is that they can make more than one dray, right? It's like their own little vacation homes. So they'll have that main nest in the tree, and that's where they'll spend most of their time and most of their time resting. But as they venture out to either find mates or to find food, they'll make a couple smaller drays in the area, sometimes 2 or 3 more, so that when they are out, if a predator comes by, or even if they need a little rest, they have a place to go if they're a little bit too far away from their original dray. And squirrels typically nest alone. For the most part, they're going to share a dray if they're mating, if the temperature dips too low and they do want to huddle together for warmth. And of course, when they're raising young, you'll find more than one within a nest. Okay. And reproduction. So all the squirrels that we talk about kind of vary when they're going to reproduce. Some of the squirrels have already started right now, and they'll continue through this early winter time period, late fall, early winter. Some will wait till about February to start. But all of the squirrels that we're going to talk about today actually mate twice a year, and they'll have litters twice a year. This gestation, or how long they carry the babies, are between 38 and 44 days. And the litter sizes range anywhere between 2 to 7 pups, with the bigger squirrels having smaller litter sizes. They are mammals, so their babies are born relatively helpless. You can see that picture on the right. It doesn't have any hair. Its eyes are closed. It's kind of pathetic, right? It needs the help of its mother to survive. So she's going to care for them for almost 3 months. She's going to nurse them. She's going to keep them warm and then protect them from whatever predators might be around the area. They are pretty good mothers, though. They even, it's been found that if they find that their nest isn't secure, or if there's an increase of predators in the area, they've actually been found to move their babies one by one to new nesting locations. Okay, so we'll start with the eastern fox squirrel, right? Because it's the largest in Ohio. And when I say largest, it's kind of funny to say that because they're still only about 3 pounds. Right now, they have that winter fur on them, right? They packed on the weight all summer, so they look a little chubby, but they don't get much bigger than 3 pounds. And these aren't original inhabitants of Ohio. So when you think about Ohio at settlement, 95% of the state was forested, okay? And these guys don't like that so much. So they are actually more common out more in the Midwest, closer to the prairie areas where there's wide openings with just some thick patches of trees, okay? So when Ohio was first settled, it was mostly trees, and it's funny to say for a squirrel, but that was actually too many trees. And they didn't start moving into the state until settlers started to chop down the trees in order to make room for agriculture. That's when the eastern fox squirrel started to come in and say that, okay, we can deal with this now. If you look at their bodies, they're a variety of different colors, right? So their body, like around their back, is that yellowish gray color. Their cheeks and their face and their feet have this reddish yellow color. And their belly, you can see, is that nice light yellow, sometimes even orangish color. And then their ears and the tips of their tails tend to be a little bit darker. And then when you look at the bulk of their tail, it's kind of this reddish orange color, which is probably where they get that fox name from. But there is some gray and black hair poking out from that big poofy tail, right? And that's just another way that they can keep warm. When we talk about mating for the eastern fox squirrel, the males are going to initiate it. They'll chase the females around. And sometimes when you see males or squirrels running around a tree or up and down a tree, that's often them courting their mate, right? But they are polygamous, so the males will mate with more than one female. And then after they're mating, the males have nothing to do with raising the young. The young here, they're going to live off milk. Remember, they are mammals for up to 5 weeks, and then they don't start foraging on the ground until about 3 months later. And then once they do start foraging and into adulthood, they eat a variety of things. So they are herbivores, meaning they eat plant material. So they eat nuts, fruits, the buds, which is the end of the sticks that we see. And occasionally they will eat insects, but it doesn't make up the bulk of their diet. So they are herbivores. A lot of times you look at a squirrel and it's just a squirrel, right? But most often the fox squirrel and the gray squirrel get confused. So if you look on the left side of your screen, that's the fox squirrel. You can see it has that reddish color, right? And it's a little bit darker. The gray squirrel, it's gray, right? It has this pretty gray coat. And if you look at its belly, it's not that soft yellow that we just saw in the last picture. It's more of this light white color that we're seeing here. So the coloration is the big giveaway, and also where they like to stay. So remember, the fox squirrels don't like heavy, densely populated forested areas, but the gray squirrels are okay with that. So you can kind of decide based on coloration and based on where you are, what squirrel you're looking at. Let's go from our biggest squirrel to our smallest squirrel, and it's the red squirrel. It's called the red squirrel because if you look at it, it has this uniform red coat, but it does have a white belly underneath. Sometimes you'll hear these called a pine squirrel because they do prefer conifers or like pine trees, the ones that keep their needles throughout the winter, but they can be found in mixed forests as long as there are conifers available. So unlike all the other squirrels we're talking about today, they're not a squirrel that buries their food. They actually make these huge piles called middens, and they'll take the pine cones and make these huge piles. Sometimes, I think there was one in Ohio that said it was 30 feet across and about 1.5 feet deep. So if you think about a squirrel this size, remember the fox squirrel was about 3 pounds. This guy is usually under a pound. So a squirrel that small making a cache of pine cones that could be 30 feet long and 1.5 feet deep, right? That's a lot of food moving for that teeny tiny squirrel. And this is a relatively small midden compared to what they could be, but they're going to pile it up and save it for later. They're not going to bury it in the ground like some of our other squirrels. So let's go on to our eastern gray squirrel. Remember, he is gray. That's where he gets his name from. You might see some red tinges throughout their fur, but for the most part, they are gray with that light white belly, and they do have this ring around their eyes. That next bullet point is kind of, I don't know, funny to say. They mature slowly and then quickly, but what we mean by that is that like all the other squirrels, they're born relatively helpless. They don't have fur, they don't have teeth. They need to survive just based on what their mother gives them. And they're not going to eat solid food for at least 7 weeks, right? They're going to survive on that mother's milk for 7 weeks. And then they're not even going to venture out of the nest until after week 10. At week 14 or 15, they can go out and survive on their own. But what we're finding is that a lot of gray squirrels will stay as a family unit for about 9 months. It doesn't always happen, but they can do that, right? But when we say they mature quickly, we're talking about their reproductive age. So even though they might stay together for 9 months, the male's breeding age is between 9 and 11 months, and females can be reproductively active between 6 to 8 months. So it's just a little bit different there. They are a little bit more social than the other squirrels we're talking about because they will share their nests. They're not as solitary as the other ones. And they are still herbivores, right? They eat a variety of nuts, seeds, and fruits, as well as some insects from a variety of different trees. So they like hickories and oaks and black walnuts and tulip trees and grapes and pawpaws, right? All the trees that are really common around here. So that's why we have this surplus of gray squirrels. And unlike our fox squirrels, who weren't here until the forests were cut down, these were really numerous. These were our most numerous, or one of our most numerous animals at the time of settlement. There's even a quote saying that it took a month for an army of squirrels to pass. So I don't know how accurate that is, but you can think about how overwhelming that many squirrels would be to new settlers. So much so that they called them a plague, right? So in the early 1800s, think about, we have 95% of the state is forested. By the early 1900s, we've chopped down so many trees that only 10% of the state is forested. That's how many were taken down. We've rebounded a little bit. The state is back up to about 30%. But if you think about going from 95% forests to 10% forests, that's a lot of squirrels to displace. And when you replace those forests with agriculture, that's like a free buffet to squirrels. So they would just come in and decimate these fields, right? So I can imagine why it would be overwhelming for those new settlers, because there would be nothing left, right? It was said that they would cause famine and suffering, which is not, those are pretty heavy words to associate with a squirrel, right? But that's how numerous their numbers were. It was kind of redundant, but you get what I mean, right? But they were so numerous and so troublesome that in 1807, Ohio enacted a law that said, okay, when you go to pay your county taxes, you also have to bring in X amount of squirrels, right? So the hunters had to go out, get the squirrels, and when you came to pay your taxes, you also had to provide a certain amount of squirrels with your county taxes, and it would change depending on what county you were in. Okay. And it was so serious that they even had penalties. So if you say you needed to come with 10 squirrels and you only brought 7, you would be penalized for not bringing those other 3, and they would charge you more taxes for that. But unfortunately, right, this was a super effective way to lower the population. But it was so effective that they decided to repeal that law by 1809. So it only lasted about 2 years. But that was one way to get the population down. Now, since we have more forested and they are not hunted as much, they've rebounded nicely as well. But it's funny to think about, if when you go to pay your taxes, you also have to bring squirrels with you. Okay, so let's go back to this conversation, right? A lot of you said you mostly see black squirrels, and I agree with you. I see black squirrels every day. I think we had a hike earlier today at Trail Lake Park, and I saw 2 just on the hike around the lake there. But these are not a different species. These are actually the eastern gray squirrels, the one that we were just talking about. They're the exact same species, but they have something called melanism. So I'm sure you've all heard of albinism, right? Where you have a lack of melanin, or that pigment that we have that gives us our hair color and our eye color and our skin color. But melanism is an overproduction of that melanin. So they appear this dark color that you see here. They're actually, even though we see a lot of them, pretty rare. They only make up about 1% of the eastern gray squirrel population. But like you all said, we see a lot of them here in Portage County, and that might be the fault of Kent State University. So the story goes that there was a groundskeeper in the 1950s. His name was Larry Woodell, and he went up to Geauga County, and that's where he first encountered black squirrels, right? And like all of us, he was kind of enamored by them. So I don't know why, but he wanted to bring them back to campus. But when he returned to Geauga County, he learned that they had been killed. So the ones that he saw, they weren't there anymore. But he still wanted to bring them back to campus. He had a friend that worked at Davy Tree at the time that had gone on a business trip to Quebec in Canada, who had seen them up there as well. And I don't know how persistent these guys are. I don't know what connections needed to be made, but at some point they made a connection with the Canadian government, who agreed to send them down 10 black squirrels. And those black squirrels were sent, they were released on Kent State's campus. And clearly they did very well, right? So in the beginning they were fed, but they began to reproduce so much that they were able to support their own population. So it's funny to think about that. Our black squirrels may be descendants of those that came from Canada, right? So next time you see a black squirrel, right? No, it's still an eastern gray squirrel. It just has melanism. All right. And let's get back to our question. So when I asked you, which one do you see the most, or which one do you think is the most common? We said a lot of gray. We said a lot of black squirrels, right? And it's funny to think that our most common squirrel is one that most of us, if not all of us, have never seen before. And that's the southern flying squirrel. So this is the most common squirrel in Ohio. But we don't see it because it's nocturnal, right? And this is the one of the four, right, that you cannot hunt. It's super cute, but it's it's a little intimidating because unlike the other ones who are all herbivores, these are omnivores, right? So they will eat the same stuff that the other ones are eating. They'll eat the seeds and the berries and things like that, but they'll also eat carrion, like dead animals. They'll eat nesting birds. They'll eat eggs, right? They'll eat a lot of stuff. Their coloration, right? You could see that there's gray color on top, but they have this white belly. And the name southern flying squirrel is kind of a misnomer, right? Because we know that bats are the only mammals capable of sustained flight. So what these guys actually do is glide. And forgive me for that photo, but that's the best one I could find of what they're actually doing. So you can see they're still very much a squirrel. They have that chubby little head, the body, these legs, that big squirrel, that big tail. But in between their front legs and their hind legs, they have this thin flap of skin that's called a patagium. And that acts like wings, essentially, right? They're not going to flap and sustain flight, but as they jump from tree to tree or limb to limb, they're going to be able to glide. Okay, so they're not going to keep flying, but they can glide from tree to tree. Okay. So when we talk about threats to our squirrels, obviously predators are a big one. They make up a good chunk of the food for our forest ecosystems. So fox, coyotes, hawks, owls, cats, if they're outside, right? All of them can easily catch a squirrel. For the most part, the lifespan of squirrels in the wild are 5 to 10 years. So they are pretty successful unless they run into some of these things. They also, like all of our other organisms, have to deal with habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. So the difference between those is habitat loss is the habitat is not there anymore, whereas habitat fragmentation is we took the habitat and maybe we broke it up by putting a road in the middle, maybe a set of condominiums, right? So now they have more, what should I say, hoops to jump through in order to get to the rest of their habitat. So like if it's a road, that's where we run into automobile problems, right? So if we put a road between what used to be one giant chunk of habitat, now they're crossing to get to the other side of the road, but they're running into cars, and that's where we see problems for squirrels as well. But they are so important to the ecosystem, right? So the last one we talked about, the threat is the fact that they were food, but they're really good for the ecosystem. They're a huge food source for all of our organisms. But luckily, we don't see their population dip too much. And it's probably because they are in that order Rodentia, right? They're rodents. And we know rodents reproduce prolifically. So probably because they are capable of making so many babies, that's why even though they're eaten a lot, we don't see their population dip too much because of this. They also regenerate forests, right? So we all know that squirrels, with the exception of that red squirrel, are going to bury nuts, right? So they take all these nuts and seeds that they find and they bury it in a variety of places. A lot of times they'll actually use guide marks in order to remind them where they put them, right? Like maybe they put it by a fence post or by a big rock, right, to kind of remind them. But they bury so many that it's impossible for them to remember all of them. And one study put out by the University of Richmond said that they don't return to about 74% of the nuts that they bury, right? That's a huge amount. So for every 100 nuts they bury, 74 of them stay in the ground. Excuse me. And that's where we get that forest regeneration, right? Because if they're not coming back to it, that those nuts either become food for other organisms that find them, or they might germinate and become a tree or a different plant, right? So squirrels are really, really useful to keep our forests thriving. And they're bioindicators, right? We see if we have a giant forest, but you don't have any squirrels there, right? Squirrels are something that naturally happen in the forest. So if they're not there, we can kind of say, okay, what's going on? Is the climate weird for them? Is there a pollutant in the area? It gives researchers a good idea of what might be going on in the area. So they're indicators of our forest health as well. Okay, so I don't know if any of you have ever come across a baby squirrel, right? If you have, before you touch it, I would encourage you to go to the ohiodnr.gov. And then if you specifically look up orphaned and injured wildlife, it gives you information on all the organisms, right? So there's a link just for squirrels, but it talks about bunnies and baby deer and raccoons and things like that as well. So before you touch it, make sure you check out this website to figure out what is the best to do for it, right? Okay. So we've made it to the question section. So I will pull up the chat box if you do have any questions. I think someone asked me before this started, how do we keep squirrels out of our bird feeders? I'm sure if you guys choose to feed birds, you've come across that problem as well. And to me, it just seems like a trial and error, right? Which one is going to work best for you? So me personally, I have one of those bird feeders that has kind of the weighted lever on it. So birds are light enough that they won't set off the lever and close the food opening, but squirrels, their weight will push it down so that they can't get to the food. And that seems to have worked well, and it lets my food last a little bit longer. They also have those baffles, right? Those cones that you can put on your shepherd's hook or whatever you keep your bird feed on. They're either in like a cone, or sometimes I think I've seen new ones where they look like a torpedo shape almost. And the other one I know of is that birds, they can't taste capsaicin, which is that chemical in like hot peppers and spicy things that makes it so spicy. Birds do not have the receptors in order to sense that it's spicy, but mammals do. So if you put like a teaspoon of cayenne pepper in your bird seed, it won't bother the birds, but the squirrels will notice it. So there's my tips for you. If you have any other tips, please put them in the chat box. Someone asked, are flying squirrels commonly found in suburban areas, or do they only live deep in the forest? So they can be found, because they are Ohio's most abundant squirrel, pretty much anywhere, right? They probably won't be found too much in urban areas because of the lack of trees, right? But one year when I worked in Akron, I had a person who had flying squirrels get into their house. So when you think of Akron, that's more of a, maybe, I don't know if it's truly urban, right? But it's more populated. It has trees, so the flying squirrels had somewhere to live, but they were there, right? So you can find them in a variety of habitats. Yeah, not just deep forests. I would love to see one. Oh, I forgot to share this, but another fun fact is that flying squirrels have been found to bioluminesce. So we haven't done a hike on this yet, but wouldn't it be so cool if we were out in the woods at night and you shine a light, one, not only to see a flying squirrel, but if you shine them under black light, some of their parts, like their nose and some of their extremities, will bioluminesce bright pink, right? So that is on my nature bucket list. I have to see a bioluminescent flying squirrel. All right. Any other questions? If you don't have questions, I want to say thank you for joining me tonight.